Secretary for the Department of Homeland Security, or DHS, Kristen Mosbrucker-Garza, and then we had U.S. Secretary for the Department of War, Pete Hegseth. I thought that was really interesting that people don't really think of SpaceX as a defense contractor, but they very much are. There's only so much you know when it comes to the contract, so we don't know exactly what they're doing, but it's very much about, detecting threats and satellites and missile tracking.
And AI.
Yes.
And they put out information that they estimate that they have injected or will have injected about $13 billion into our local economy.
Yeah, an economic impact of $13 billion is massive.
Hi, and thank you for joining us on this episode of the Rio Grande Valley Business Journal's podcast. I'm Naxi Lopez, and today we have our ace reporter, Kristen Mosbrucker-Garza, and together we are going to unpack some of the biggest headlines that the Rio Grande Valley has seen recently. So, Kristen, thank you so much for joining us.
Of course.
All right, Kristen. So let's start with two high-profile visits to the Rio Grande Valley from two top Trump administration officials. Tell us who was here, and what they were here for. And of course, you covered both events for us.
Absolutely. So we had the U.S. Secretary for the Department of Homeland Security, or DHS, Kristen Mosbrucker-Garza, and then we had the U.S. Secretary for the Department of War, previously known as the Department of Defense, Pete Hegseth. It happened basically 1 week after the other. I got to be on the ground with the DHS secretary, and they actually both went to Cameron County as well, which I thought was interesting. So we started in Brownsville with Secretary Nome. She first addressed a roundtable of farmers and ranchers, local people in our community, everybody from a rancher in Starr County who essentially had a cattle operation, and she kind of talked about, the concept of border security and what it was like to try to run a business during a time when, there was just a lot of influx of migrants crossing, a lot of people seeking asylum, and then what it's like now under the Trump administration. So what it was like under Biden, what it's like under Trump. There were some other folks. There was a farmer from San Juan, and there was even the sheriff of Brooks County. So it was a really interesting discussion, and it actually happened on a ranch outside of Brownsville, actually on the other side of the border wall. So something that I actually learned that I didn't quite realize, and I don't think most people realize, is that the border wall is not actually right up against the Rio Grande River.
Right. For a lot of reasons.
Right. It actually more or less follows the old levee system. And part of that is because I was told that if they were to build it right up against the river, it would actually push rainwater into Mexico, and we wouldn't get as much water on our crops.
Okay, that's not good.
Yeah, right. And farmers wouldn't get as much water either. That it would essentially change the whole floodplain as well. And so that's one reason. And the other reason is, of course, permissions and stuff. And so it's just something that people don't quite realize is that, there's a lot of properties that extend on both sides of the border wall, and you're actually still in the U.S. So when
you're between the river and the border wall, pretty much.
Yes. And so it's an interesting thing, because typically, unless it's your property, you wouldn't be there, right?
Sure.
So it was just an interesting experience, being routed to the directions of this ranch, and I'm like, wait a minute, I'm supposed to go through the border wall, it's you kind of double check your direction.
Am I gonna need my passport?
Right, because if you were to, for whatever reason, cross into Mexico, you would have to go back through the port of entry. That's the rules.
Sure.
But yeah, so it was a dove hunting and agriculture ranch, in sort of the rural parts of Brownsville, and the owners of the ranch were there too, and they were kind of talking about what it was like before and after the wall as well. So it was interesting that she brought a lot of essentially small business owners to the table to kind of like hear their concerns and kind of like get feedback about what they need in our community.
And so what were some of those concerns? Because, what I'm hearing, right, is that they brought people who basically said, during the Biden administration, there was some chaos, right? And now they're seeing those numbers decrease. But what are those concerns that they still have today?
I'd say that they still see illegal activity, right? Like that it's not that potential cartel activity has been eliminated. But I really got the sense that they felt like when there was an issue that they saw on the ground, that there was just like a stronger relationship between the landowner and Border Patrol, CBP and DHS, that like someone was there to pick up the call, someone was there to like come to the scene and help them with whatever it was. Like they definitely felt a stronger sense of security, and I think that really made a difference for them. So I kind of got the sense that they wanted more of the kind of the service that they've been getting, more attention, definitely, and that otherwise, like I think it's just feeling heard.
And so, did anybody mention, we've heard time and time again that agriculture, right, farmers, these immigration raids are having an effect on their workforce. Did anybody mention that at this event?
No, they didn't mention that. I mean, I will say primarily people in agriculture tend to use the H-2A agricultural visa program.
There are some avenues, right, for that industry as
Right.
opposed to other industries that, that is a very good point.
Yeah, so I mean, there were definitely some fears about potential ICE raids on agriculture, especially during harvest season. But I haven't heard from the agriculture industry or produce industry that has come to fruition. Now on the construction side, we have heard that. We've seen all the videos of ICE agents coming on to construction properties. And so during the round table, like we weren't really allowed to interact or ask questions, but she ended up doing a tour on a horse, actually.
Okay.
So apparently Border Patrol has like mounted horse patrol.
Yeah, they do.
And so it's part of their system. And so she took a tour of the border on a horse, and they had the boats and the water and all of that. And then we actually went to go see some buoys that they're essentially putting in the water. I believe it'll be about 500 or so buoys. There is some concern locally that the buoys may affect like the flow of water and like the flow of like any like legitimate business activity as well. So they're not necessarily they're a little controversial, I guess. But we got a chance to see the buoys, and they're actually made by a Texas company too.
Interesting.
I think they're out of Burnett, Texas. Gibraltar, I believe, is the name of the company. And so there's also like this kind of like American manufacturing, to build the fence and then to build the buoys. So it was very much focused, I would say, on like look at how much investment that we're making, a priority for the southern border, the idea that there aren't nearly as many people, if anyone, really crossing as compared to, when there was just a lot more focus on processing all of the people seeking asylum. Like, that just seemed like it took up all of the time of Border Patrol when, they could have been responding more to the community. So I thought that was really interesting. But during that time when they were unveiling the buoy, we were allowed to ask questions. So surprisingly, somewhat fortunate enough to be, called on. So I asked a question that, we've been hearing a lot in our communities about the ICE raids, and, basically said something to the extent of, people are telling us that it's hurting our economy, that, because of the aggressiveness of the raids, that there are actually people who have legal work status who are being swept up in this process, and essentially, like, there's some projects being delayed or some projects being slowed down, either from, lack of workers or people just literally being taken off the job. And, what she would say as DHS secretary to those business owners, like, what is her response to them?
And what did she say?
Well, I don't think she has heard the same stories on the ground. She definitely, deflected that, she didn't think that was very much the case. And, really reiterated that if you are, if you have legal status, whether, as an employer or as an employee, that, you really have nothing to worry about. And that employers who are doing everything right, also, should not be concerned, essentially. So, I think it was just one of those situations where Washington can be a very isolated place, right? And they're not hearing the same things on the ground.
And so we actually spoke to the leaders of two of the Valley's builder associations. And one of them, really spoke about, exactly what you're talking about, right? South Texas Builders Association really rang the bell when it came to the industry and construction and the ICE enforcement. And so if you haven't watched those two podcasts, they're available on our website. But yeah, this is, this is a big issue for our community. And I'm surprised that, maybe not surprised, right? But this is kind of the typical response that we get from Washington. And I covered a lot of these events myself, right? When we have top administration officials, they're usually here at the border to talk about border security, right? That's really the only time that we hear from them, except for this most recent visit from Pete Hegseth, right? Talk to us about that. How does that visit differ from what we're usually accustomed to hearing here in the Rio Grande Valley?
Yeah, I was really surprised just how much time he spent down here in the valley. He came and did sort of a whirlwind tour of Texas. So he went to Fort Worth to visit a Lockheed Martin facility there. So more of a legacy defense contractor, talking to some of the workers about really how the military is trying to speed up its not just procurement process, but also, getting whatever they purchase from defense contractors in the field to the warfighter, like, as soon as possible. Basically not waiting years and years for a perfect project, like, like being okay with something that's just a really strong prototype, like really trying to, I think, change the way the military functions. And, there was a little bit of a similar message when he came to Starbase, but it was also markedly different, right? So he first got a tour of SpaceX, of their manufacturing facility, because that was kind of the other thing. It was this like arsenal of freedom kind of tour was the concept, is that he was looking at the capabilities that the U.S. military has around the country. And, I don't think as many people think of SpaceX as a defense contractor.
Right.
But
You
they
think
are.
rockets.
Well, you do. But right before the visit, we noticed that SpaceX had gotten a like $700 million contract from the Department of War out of like a total of like $7 billion that they've gotten over the years.
With a B.
Yes. That is the second largest sort of tranche of contracts that they've gotten from the federal government. Mm-hmm. Number one, of course, being from NASA at like, 17 billion, something like that. And I thought that was really interesting that people don't really think of SpaceX as a defense contractor, but they very much are. They just got this missile tracking. There's only so much when it comes to the contract, so
right.
we don't know exactly what they're doing, but it's very much about detecting threats and satellites and missile tracking. So
and AI.
Yes, and so there's a facet of that too. So at this, after the tour by Elon Musk himself, right? He came down, and word on the street is that he does have his voter registration in the city of Starbase because he's so proud of it, right? He recognized the employees, just really how far that they came, going from essentially what he described as nothing to, this rocket launching manufacturing town, essentially, because, I think the government very much is interested in domestic military manufacturing capability, and that's something that they're doing there at Starbase. And so, Hegseth actually took, I think, a longer speech time at SpaceX than he did at Lockheed Martin, and that was kind of surprising to me. And he didn't mention the missile contract. He kind of, talked a little bit about SpaceX and what they've built in terms of the rockets and rocket ship building and all the testing. But he actually used that as an opportunity to introduce a new contract with another company that's run by Elon Musk, which is called XAI. So X is formerly Twitter that Musk acquired a number of years ago. And his AI venture is this tool called Grok, which is essentially an alternative to like Google's Gemini or ChatGPT, very similar concept. You might see it reply to X threads on social media. But essentially, the Department of War, so inside of the Pentagon networks, their computer networks, on both the classified system, so that is like top secret stuff, and the unclassified, civilian level information is going to be open to AI, specifically Grok. So Elon Musk's AI product is now going inside of the Department of Defense's networks. And that's a really big deal because the only other company that had that level of access was Google with their Gemini product. And so I thought that was really interesting. And he also made a number of statements about how they're bringing down essentially any impediment to AI being able to crawl around and find answers and synthesize whatever it needs to do, with the exception of any congressional statute. So essentially, they have free reign.
Okay.
With the exception of anything that is explicitly not allowed, by Congress. And that's a really big change, right? Because the Department of Defense, I used to
holds
cover
everything
them
to their chest, right? I mean, to open up not just their unclassified, but to open up their classified records too to AI nonetheless, right? I mean, I hope they know what they're doing.
Yeah, and I think it's really about speed, right? And I think that is kind of what it comes down to. And interestingly, and maybe this is why they didn't mention it. So, the government is all about, getting whatever they purchased, like, to the warfighter or the product being delivered. But just a couple months ago, we had the former head of NASA, chiding SpaceX, basically saying, hey, you said you were going to build starships for a lunar mission and we're losing out to China. Like, you're actually kind of behind schedule. Like, it was to the point where they publicly threatened to reopen that contract and give other companies a chance to bid on it. Now that top administrator has, left office. So, there has been a bit of a change there. But it was just interesting to me that, they talked so much about speed, and yet SpaceX had, previously been called out for not building what they promised they were going to build fast enough.
Sure, right. And so bottom line, these contracts, these defense contracts that SpaceX is being awarded, how is that going to impact what's happening here regionally? Do we know if any of the things that they're manufacturing or owe to the U.S. government, if they are going to be built here, if it's going to play a part here in this region?
So there's a lot that we don't know yet. I will say anything having to do with the SpaceX rockets, with rocket testing, absolutely, that will probably happen within the city of Starbase. They're building a second launch pad right now. They have the Gigabay manufacturing facility, $250 million facility that's under construction, that's supposed to manufacture in mass these starships, right, these rockets. But in terms of the AI portfolio and that contract, we just don't know, very much about like whether their workforce is at Starbase or not. And same thing with the missile tracking. I'm not quite sure, but it was awarded to SpaceX, and SpaceX's headquarters is now in Starbase, right? Boca Chica, Brownsville area. So, it will remain to be seen. But separately, honestly, we do expect the number of employees at SpaceX to continue to grow because of existing contracts and because of their original plans. They have about 3,000 some employees right now. They expect to hire at least 1,000 or so more. And so, you see job postings, you see that kind of momentum.
And, they put out information that they estimate that they have injected or will have injected about $13 billion into our local economy since they started all the way to the end of 2026, which, is a big amount, right?
Yeah, an economic impact of $13 billion is massive. I mean, it really has changed Cameron County. It has changed the Brownsville area. I mean, everything from the job market to housing to new restaurants and retailers. Like, there is definitely a resurgence, and that honestly doesn't even include the number of visitors that come.
The indirect, I guess, economic impact, right? Because when we're talking about 13 billion, is that direct or indirect impact? Do we know?
I believe that's total economic impact.
Okay.
But I do think that it's notable that, like, basically every time they have a proposed rocket launch, because it's not guaranteed, right? It's testing. I think it's something like 10 to 12,000 visitors from outside of that community come to Brownsville. And so, I mean, what other event that regularly occurs brings that many people to the Rio Grande Valley? Like, I can't think of a single one.
And if there are, it's an annual thing, right? But this is ongoing, because these test flights are happening, with more and more frequency. I believe there's going to be one at the end of this month. So, a lot of attraction, a lot of tourism, a lot of economic impact in that area.
Yeah, and it's really shining a spotlight, I think, on the Rio Grande Valley that, I mean, I heard some people, because, they all come from Washington, and they're like, never heard of Brownsville before. And, now they have.
Yeah. Wow. And so that area, right? Cameron County, Willacy County, they're going through major redevelopment when it comes to data centers, right? That's been kind of the hot topic on, in our internet circles here in the Rio Grande Valley with some opposition. Let's switch gears and talk about those data centers that are coming to Cameron and Willacy County.
Absolutely. So I think it's really interesting because when people think of an AI data center, they think of like, the $1.5 billion massive structure that Meta or Facebook is building in El Paso, right?
Mm-hmm.
Something that is just a giant building, sucks up a lot of water and electricity and needs like really fast internet. But actually, when you look at some of the projects that are being proposed and that are under construction right now, they look very different. And so, for example, Willacy County is essentially becoming a data center hub. Like, they're building a cluster, and they're doing it in an interesting way. So typically, and there's a lot of data center construction all across Texas.
Sure.
So it's not just the Valley, but it's coming to us. And I think it's coming to us because we have all the wind farms, right? Because that's been a really sticky issue, is that communities worry about, how much electricity costs. We don't have a very strong transmission line network in the Valley, and so we're very much a little bit at the end of the line when it comes to the existing capacity to just operate our communities. And so if there were another
extra strain, right?
Yeah, extra strain like coming online, like that would potentially make a difference, right? But in Willacy County, all of the essentially 2 major data centers that are being built is by a company called Soluna. They're out of New York, and their whole model is that they're green data centers or renewable data centers, and that they're also modular. So they're not that like really big building. They're actually smaller buildings, and they're using all of the excess wind power that is already being generated in Willacy County. Because what happened over the past decade is essentially everyone discovered that it's really windy in Texas. We have the migratory, bird pathways. And so a bunch of companies all at the same time picked very similar locations to build their wind farms. Well, what happens in Texas is that when you go to sell that electricity to ERCOT, which is like the market operator, if you're all going in at the same time, the chances of you actually getting negative pricing on the market is really high. And so that's what was happening, is that there was too much power trying to be sold into the grid from the same place. We don't have the transmission network to like sell it other places very quickly. We don't have a lot of battery storage either. So it would essentially be lost, or they would have to sell it at a loss. So the wind farms found the data center company and was like, hey, data centers require a lot of electricity. We are wasting a lot of electricity. Come to us. And that's essentially what happened. So Soluna is building Project Katie. The first version, it's under construction right now. It's about $50 million in, essentially near the county line of Willacy and Cameron County, and like farm to market 1420, something like that. So it's nowhere near like Raymondville, or, I guess the closest community is Lyford, which honestly, it's all very rural anyway. On the middle of a wind farm, it's very desolate. And they're building a data center there. And then just this week, they are building a second data center. So the first data center is going to be primarily for cryptocurrency mining. And then the second data center is going to be primarily for artificial intelligence. So, it's very much following the pattern of, the types of things that data centers why they're being built,
Sure.
but slightly different in the way of how they're being built is what I would say. And then I just found out that that same company is actually building 2 data centers in Cameron County.
Also following the same method, right? Finding wind farms, existing wind farms, to be able to purchase that energy from those wind farms.
Yes. I still haven't figured out which wind farms they are because they don't disclose that right away. But it's interesting because that would actually be the 3rd data center that would be built in Cameron County. The other one would actually connect to the electric grid, and that one has faced, I would say, the most opposition so far. People going to the city of Harlingen, city commission, and basically saying, hey, let's slow down a little bit. Let's make sure before we approve, whether it be water resources. So for example, Harlingen Water Works is, negotiating a deal with this company.
I thought they had already signed that deal. They had already executed the deal to provide the water. What's the word?
The effluent water?
Yes.
Yeah. So we have Harlingen Waterworks. Their board did meet, and I believe it's almost like an MOU. I don't think it's a definitive contract. Because the project has not been built yet, right? And so I think the company was just kind of making sure the infrastructure was in place. So this company in Cameron County, it won't actually be within the city limits of Harlingen. It will be in the county, but it will be right next to the Valley International Airport. There's a lot of industrial land there. So that's the proposed one. It's called Ennius Energy. They're out of Scotland. And I haven't seen many other projects that we can point to that they've completed. So, it definitely does feel like kind of an early stage project for them. Though I did notice when I looked at the Cameron County deeds that they have essentially an option to purchase all of that land from some farmers in Willacy County, the Stone Brothers. And basically they have to make a decision by April about whether or not they're going to move forward. So
everything, it seems like they're lining up their ducks, right? Making sure that everything that they need to actually operate is in place, but it's not a done deal yet.
Correct.
Would that be the right way to frame it?
Yeah, I think they're doing their due diligence, right? Making sure that the infrastructure is in place because they filed a document with the Public Utility Commission, right? Essentially the state regulators. And they said, hey, we want to build this project in Cameron County, but just like Soluna Energy, they specifically said that they were interested in waiting for the infrastructure to essentially catch up, that they would do it as 16 data center halls rather than that massive building as well, building it out modularly to make sure that they're not building something that they can't connect to the grid.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, because then, I'm thinking if you wait to build, the cost of building is going to go up. And how do we keep the company to its word? They could say this, right? And then, if it doesn't make financial sense for them, right, what's to stop them from actually moving forward in a way that is profitable or more profitable for them? Right. So still a lot of questions left, I suppose. And then is there any way that I know that a lot of residents are going to their to the county, to the city, trying to see if they can maybe postpone this or stop this. Do they have that power,
I mean, I do get the sense that the company will be seeking economic incentives. For example, in Willacy County, Soluna did get a tax abatement for its project. And so I imagine that maybe something similar will be sought in Cameron County. And so, at some point it is going to have to probably go before an official. Now, whether it's on the city or the county level or just the EDC level is really remain to be seen. I mean, I don't get the sense that there's really like an off switch to all of this,
Right.
because
They can't just say, "Oh no." They could
there's
deter by maybe not incentivizing, right? But being able to outright stop it, I mean, that just seems like it's not the
It's
role
also,
of the
yeah.
government to do.
It's also, I mean, the land is a private deal, right? It doesn't include, it's not government property, it's private property. And so, for them to buy the land is private, for them to negotiate the water is also a contract, right? That has already, been at least somewhat hashed out. In terms of water requirements, they are trying to get what's called effluent water, right? And so that's not potable water, that's not drinking water, like that's not groundwater, like that is not even from the Rio Grande River raw water. It is actually wastewater that has been treated to the point that it can be discharged into the Arroyo Colorado River. And so, like, this would essentially just be water, that would be put back out into the environment. And, companies would typically have to like build some kind of filtration system for them to use it on an industrial level anyway. And I was at an event earlier today where they were discussing water in the Rio Grande Valley, and I was asking some folks about like whether the valley has enough water for data centers. And, I was told that essentially if they are looking for that effluent water, that, some of the bigger cities like do have it available, that it would not actually be a strain on their system. Now, some of the smaller cities, probably not, because they're not, processing as many million gallons per day.
Sure.
But, 4.5 million gallons of effluent water from a city as big as Harlingen, like, that's actually probably pretty doable.
And yet, we're not just seeing this apparent opposition from residents. Now we're also hearing from people like Sid Miller, right? Saying, hey, Texas, let's kind of pause a little bit and make sure that, that the water, that our resources, we account for them for what we really need them before kind of giving them away. And then after that, we saw Cameron County also put out a statement saying that, that they are going to do their due diligence. So it's not just residents, right? I think everybody's kind of looking at this as far as really the big issues, water and energy, right? And making sure that that there's enough for, residents, right, and businesses that are already established. So that's an interesting kind of take, right, from our state officials as well.
No, for sure. And, I think so Sid Miller, the agriculture commissioner, came out with this concept that he's pitching. It's called like freedom agriculture zones or agricultural freedom zones. And that would be really interesting in communities like the Valley, because, we have so much agricultural land that is being developed. And it kind of sounded like what he was interested in is enticing more companies to develop on what are called like brownfields or greenfields, something that, maybe is a redevelopment project, or maybe, the soil has never been used for, something that requires agriculture, like, ranching or farming. But, taking land that is already situated near an irrigation canal that has been, used for harvest after harvest after harvest, whether it's citrus or, leafy greens for generations, and then turning that into a data center, like, is it just a very different proposition. So, it does sound like there's some movement on the agricultural front that, probably farmers are saying, like, is this really how we want to develop our land that we've preserved?
And I think there was a quote in Sid Miller's press release that we heard from our citrus industry when we were covering that earlier on, and it's basically to the point saying that once you pave over agricultural land, there really is no going back. No one's going to come in there and break that cement and plant things again. So something to keep in mind, right, as they move forward. And then the solution, right, that they're proposing to build on these, what are they called, brownsides or brownstone? Brownfields. Okay, brownfields. I imagine it would be a lot more costly for businesses to, redevelop it because, they're obviously have pollution, they're marked that way for a reason. But there are a lot of grants out there that these companies can also apply for that would help cover the cost of redeveloping that, those areas. So just something to think about as well.
Yeah, I think that, this concept of how we're developing land as the Rio Grande Valley suburbanizes and urbanizes is definitely going to come to a forefront. So, whether it's for data centers or whether it's for something else, I think that, it's a conversation that we're going to have.
All right. Well, we went through a lot of things today, a lot of headlines. Anything else that you'd want to add that maybe I didn't ask that you think, is important to cover?
Like I said, I feel like the demand for AI, generative AI, is really only projected to grow. And, the concept that, we're going to be some kind of bubble with no data centers, I just don't think is going to happen. Mm-hmm. And so it will be interesting to see how municipalities and EDCs and cities kind of negotiate, what is the most sustainable way for this to happen, right? Mm-hmm. How do we make this a win-win situation? And maybe, the answer is the co-location with the wind turbines, because that is electricity that, is otherwise being wasted. And it's a different model than what I think a lot of people think of when they think of a data center.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Kristen, for helping us unpack these headlines. Please head to our website, subscribe. You can read so much about all of this and more. But thank you for watching, and we'll see you next week.